My name is Whitney Marsh. I am 44 years old, and I'm a physical therapist at an outpatient clinic in Boise, Idaho. 4 years ago, my ex-husband Brad and I got divorced. We didn't sell our house right away. We couldn't afford to buy each other out, and with our kids in the middle of high school, neither of us wanted to uproot them. So our settlement agreement said we'd keep the house jointly for a while, rent it out, split any rental income, and split the mortgage costs from a shared account we both still contribute to. The plan was to sell once our younger son graduated, about 2 years from now. For the last 14 months, Brad told me the house was between tenants. First a bad tenant who trashed a bedroom, then repairs, then almost ready to list again. I kept paying my half of the mortgage on what I thought was a property generating no income for either of us. Then, 3 weeks ago, picking up our son for a weekend, he mentioned, completely casually, with no idea it meant anything, that Dad's girlfriend Courtney basically lives at the house now. She's been there since like last spring. That's almost the entire 14 months Brad told me the house was empty. Before I get into it, if this is your first time here, I tell stories like this one most days, true stories about families and the quiet arrangements inside them that nobody really examines until something forces them to. If that sounds like your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read all of them. Okay. Let me back up and explain how Brad and I got to this arrangement in the first place, because I think the why of it matters for understanding what happened next. Brad and I were married for 16 years. We met in our mid-20s. I was finishing my doctorate in physical therapy. He was working as a project manager for a construction company, and for a long time, things were good. We bought our house in 2011, a 4-bedroom in the Bench neighborhood of Boise, close to good schools, with a backyard big enough for the trampoline our kids spent an unreasonable amount of their childhoods on. We had 2 kids, Ava, now 19 and in her sophomore year at the University of Idaho, and Tyler, 16, a junior in high school. The divorce, when it came 4 years ago, wasn't dramatic in the way I think people sometimes expect these stories to be. There wasn't an affair, at least not when I knew about at the time, though I'll get to that. It was more that, over the last few years of our marriage, Brad and I had become 2 people who ran a household together very efficiently and connected almost nowhere else. We tried counseling for about 8 months. It helped us communicate better about logistics, which, ironically, probably made the eventual divorce smoother than it might have been. But it didn't fix the underlying thing, which was that neither of us particularly wanted to be married to the other anymore, even though neither of us could point to a single dramatic reason why. I should say a little more about what those last few years of the marriage actually looked like, because I think it explains why the divorce itself was relatively calm, even though what happened later with the house definitely was not. Brad and I were, in a lot of ways, a very functional team. We split household tasks without much conflict. We never fought about money in the way I know some couples do, and we were genuinely aligned on how we wanted to raise Ava and Tyler, same values about screen time, same approach to discipline, same instinct to show up for every school thing even when we were both exhausted. For years, I think that functional partnership was enough to paper over the fact that, underneath it, we'd slowly stopped being especially curious about each other. We'd ask, "How was your day?" and get real answers, but they were logistics-shaped answers. What happened at work? What needed to happen tomorrow? And somewhere along the way, the parts of each other we used to be curious about just stopped getting asked about. I remember the moment it became undeniable for me. It was a Tuesday evening, maybe 5 years ago, and Brad had just gotten back from a work trip. I asked him how it went, and he gave me a thorough, detailed answer. And about halfway through, I realized I wasn't really listening, not because I didn't care about him, but because nothing in the answer connected to anything in my own inner life anymore. We were two competent adults running a household with real warmth toward each other and almost no remaining overlap in the things that made either of us feel alive. When I brought this up to Brad a few months later, gently, not as an accusation, he said something that I think about a lot. "Yeah, I've felt that too. I just didn't know if it was a problem or just what being married for 15 years feels like." We tried counseling, like I mentioned, and it helped us name what was happening, even if it didn't change it. By the end of that process, we both arrived independently at something neither of us said out loud for a while, that we genuinely liked each other, respected each other as parents, and probably shouldn't be married anymore. When we finally had that conversation directly, it was almost anticlimactic, more sad than angry, both of us a little relieved that the other person felt it too. The house situation came up early in our settlement discussions, and I want to walk through the logic of it, because at the time, it genuinely felt like the most reasonable option available to us, not some reluctant compromise. Neither of us could afford to buy the other out at the house's full value. Boise's housing market had gone up enormously since 2011, and the house, which we'd bought for around $240,000, was by the time of our divorce worth somewhere around $480,000, with maybe $310,000 of that being equity after the remaining mortgage. Half of that equity, $155,000, was more cash than either of us had sitting around, and refinancing to pull that out on either of our individual incomes would have meant a mortgage payment neither of us could comfortably handle alone. Selling immediately had its own problems. Ava was a junior and Tyler was a freshman, both at the high school they'd attended since 9th grade, both with friend groups and activities tied to that specific neighborhood. Our mediator, a kind, practical woman named Mr. Alvarez's colleague, actually, I'll get to Mr. Alvarez in a minute, pointed out that selling immediately, in the middle of a divorce, while also moving the kids to new schools, was stacking transitions in a way that tends to be harder on kids than people expect going in. So we landed on what felt, at the time, like a genuinely thoughtful middle path. Brad would move out. He found a 2-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away, and I would stay in the house with the kids, since I was the one with the more flexible schedule for school pickups, and the one who, frankly, both kids said they'd rather stay with day-to-day. The house itself would remain jointly owned. We'd continue to split the mortgage from a joint account we kept open specifically for shared kid and house expenses. Groceries for the kids' weeks with Brad, school fees, the mortgage, that kind of thing, each of us depositing an agreed amount monthly. And in 2 years, once Tyler graduated, we'd sell the house, split the proceeds evenly, and both of us would use our share to find something smaller on our own. I want to pause here and be honest about something, because I think it's relevant to how I reacted to everything that came later. For the first roughly 2.5 years after the divorce, this arrangement worked basically as intended, and I want to give Brad real credit for that. He was reliable about the joint account. He came to school events. He and I developed what I describe as a genuinely functional co-parenting relationship. Better, in some ways, than our marriage had been in its last few years, because so much of the tension that had built up between us turned out to be about the marriage itself, not about either of us as people or as parents. About 1.5 years ago, Brad mentioned, in the kind of casual way you mention things to an ex you're on decent terms with, that he'd started seeing someone, a woman named Courtney, who he'd met through a coworker. I remember being genuinely happy for him, in the uncomplicated way you can be happy for someone you used to be married to, but no longer have any romantic feelings for. The kids met Courtney a few months after that, and from what they told me, she seemed nice, a dental hygienist, a few years younger than Brad, no kids of her own. I'm telling you all of this because I want to be clear that nothing about the existence of Courtney, on its own, was ever the issue here. The issue was specifically what happened with the house, and the fact that I only found out about the overlap between Courtney living at the house and the house being empty, according to Brad by accident, through our 16-year-old on a completely unrelated weekend pickup. The Between Tenants story started about 14 months ago. I remember the timeline pretty clearly because it started right after a conversation Brad and I had about the joint account Tyler needed braces, which was an unexpectedly large expense, and we'd had to talk about adjusting our monthly contributions for a few months to cover it. In that same conversation, Brad mentioned that the tenants who'd been renting the house, a young couple, I'd met them once at a handoff, were moving out at the end of their lease, and that he'd handle finding new tenants since he lived closer to the property and had been the one managing it. A few weeks later, Brad told me the new tenants had backed out at the last minute, something about a job falling through, and the house was sitting empty while he looked for new ones. Then, about 2 months after that, he told me he'd found a tenant, but during the move-in walkthrough, they discovered a bedroom carpet that had been badly damaged by the previous tenant's dog, something the previous tenants hadn't disclosed, and the new tenant had backed out over it, and Brad was now dealing with replacing the carpet, which had turned into a bigger project than expected because of some subfloor damage underneath. I want to be honest. At no point during any of this did any part of me think Brad was lying. Why would I? This is exactly the kind of thing that happens with rental properties. I don't manage rentals myself, but I have friends who do, and tenant fell through, found unexpected damage, repairs took longer than planned, is such a normal, boring, plausible sequence of events that it never once occurred to me to question it. Brad would periodically mention the house in our co-parenting conversations, still working on the subfloor. Got a quote for the carpet, more than I hoped. Almost ready to list it again, and I'd say something like, that's a pain, and we'd move on to talking about Tyler's homecoming or Ava's class schedule. The conversation with Tyler that changed everything happened on a Friday afternoon in early spring, during the 15-minute drive from his school to my house for his weekend with me. I want to describe it as plainly as I can, because the thing that stuck with me most about it is how completely unremarkable it felt in the moment. Tyler was telling me about a group project for his history class, and somewhere in the middle of that, almost as an aside, he said something like, "Yeah, me and my partner are supposed to meet up this weekend, but I'm at your house this weekend, so I told him I'd just do my part and send it over. It's easier than trying to coordinate at Dad's house anyway, especially with Courtney's stuff everywhere." I said something like, "Courtney's stuff," genuinely just making conversation, the way you do with a 16-year-old who's giving you a rare window into his life. "Yeah, she's basically living there now," Tyler said, still focused on his phone, not even really looking up. "She moved most of her stuff in last spring, I think. It's fine, she's nice, she just has a lot of plants. The living room is kind of a jungle now." I think I said something like, "Oh, that's nice," on autopilot, the way you respond to a teenager's offhand comment while your brain is somewhere else entirely. And then, a few seconds later, my brain caught up to what I just heard, and I had to actively focus on the road, because something had clicked into place that I didn't like at all. "Wait," I said, "living where, bud? At Dad's apartment?" Tyler looked up from his phone with the specific expression teenagers get when they realize they might have said something they weren't supposed to say, even though they have no idea what it was. No, at the house. Our house. I mean your old house. Dad's place. Tyler, I said, trying to keep my voice as normal as possible, Dad doesn't live at the house. The house has been, I thought the house didn't have anyone living in it right now. It's been having repair issues. Tyler looked genuinely confused. What? No, Dad's lived there for like a long time. Since before Courtney moved in, actually. I thought you knew that. If you've ever had a teenager casually reveal something that completely rearranged what you thought was true, type "wait" in the comments. I want to know how often this happens, because in the moment, it took everything I had not to pull the car over right there. I didn't say much else to Tyler on the drive. I didn't want to put him in the position of feeling like he'd done something wrong, and honestly, I needed time to think before I said anything else. That evening, after Tyler had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started doing the math. The way I imagine a lot of people in this situation end up doing, going back through bank statements, text messages, anything with a timestamp on it. What I pieced together, over the course of that evening and the following few days, was this. The tenants moving out conversation had happened almost exactly 14 months earlier. According to Tyler, and later, when I gently asked Ava the same kind of question, she confirmed it. Brad had moved back into the house himself shortly after that, not into some temporary arrangement while he looked for new tenants, but as his actual residence, giving up his apartment lease entirely. Courtney had moved in with him there a few months later, sometime last spring, which lined up with what Tyler had said about since last spring. For 14 months, the house had not been between tenants. It had been Brad and Courtney's home. And for 14 months, I had been paying my half of the mortgage from our joint account into a house that was generating exactly zero rental income. Not because of bad luck with tenants and carpet damage, but because Brad had simply decided at some point to live there himself with his girlfriend instead of renting it out, and had never told me. I want to describe what it felt like, doing that math, because I think the financial part of it is actually not the part that hit me hardest, even though the financial part is real and significant. Over 14 months, my half of the mortgage came to a little over $9,800. If the house had actually been rented during that time, which Brad and I had always discussed as the plan, and which, based on what similar houses in our neighborhood were renting for, would have brought in somewhere around $2,400 a month. My half of that rental income would have been around $16,800. So the gap between what I'd actually paid and what I would have received if things were as Brad had described them was somewhere in the neighborhood of $26,000. But the number, honestly, wasn't the thing that kept me up that night. What kept me up was the apartment. Brad had given up his apartment, an actual documented lease, with an actual moving truck, presumably, and moved back into a house that I co-owned, lived in it for 14 months, and at no point did it occur to him that this was something I might want to know about. Not because it violated our settlement, although it did, but because it meant that for 14 months, every conversation we'd had about the house, every still working on the subfloor, every almost ready to list it, had been, to one degree or another, something he was making up in real time while standing in the kitchen of a house I half-owned. I called my sister, Kim, that night. She lives in Seattle, but we talk most days, and she was the person I most needed to talk to before I did anything else. I told her everything, the conversation with Tyler, the math, the apartment, all of it. Kim was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that ended up shaping how I approached the next few weeks. Okay, before you do anything, I think there's a version of this where Brad genuinely thought this was fine, somehow in his head. And there's a version where he knew exactly what he was doing and just hoped you'd never find out. And I think how you handle this might honestly look different depending on which one it actually is, so I'd try to find that out before you decide what you want. I didn't call Brad that night. I gave myself a few days, partly to keep gathering information, and partly because I genuinely didn't trust myself to have that conversation calmly yet, and I wanted to go into it without it turning into something that would make the actual issue. The house, the settlement, the money, harder to address because the conversation had become about anger instead. During those few days, I found myself doing something I hadn't expected, driving past the house. It's not really on my way anywhere anymore, but one evening after work, I took the long way home, past the house I'd lived in for over a decade, raised both my kids in, and apparently hadn't set foot inside in over a year. There were 2 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize, and there was a planter box on the front porch that hadn't been there before, full of something green and leafy. There were string lights along the porch railing. It looked, from the outside, like a home, somebody's home, lived in and cared for, and the strange, disorienting thing was that it was still, on paper, half mine, and I had absolutely no idea who lived there or what it looked like inside. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there for a few minutes, looking at a house I technically co-owned, that I couldn't have told you a single thing about the inside of, and feeling something I can only describe as a strange kind of grief. Not for the marriage, which I'd made peace with a long time ago, but for the version of co-ownership I'd believed I was part of, which apparently hadn't existed for over a year. I called Kim again the next day and told her about the drive-by. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Okay, I think you need to talk to Brad before you do anything else. Not a lawyer, not me again, him, because right now you're carrying around a story in your head about what this means, and some of that story might be right and some of it might not be, and you won't know which until you actually ask him." She also said something that stuck with me, and for what it's worth, whatever he says, I don't think you're going to regret asking calmly before you decide what you think about it. You can always get angrier later if it turns out you need to. You can't really walk back the other direction. I called Brad on a Tuesday evening after the kids were both occupied with their own things. I didn't lead with accusations. I said, "Hey, I need to ask you something about the house, and I want you to know up front that I already know the answer, so I'd really appreciate it if you were straight with me." There was a pause, a long one. "Okay," he said, in a tone that told me he already knew exactly what I was about to ask. "Tyler mentioned, completely by accident, that you and Courtney have been living at the house. For a while. Is that true?" Another pause. "Yeah," Brad said. "Yeah, it's true. Whitney, okay. Can I explain? I know how this looks." "I'd like you to explain," I said. "But I also want to be clear that I already know it's been about 14 months, and I already know that's almost exactly when the tenants moved out conversation happened. So I'm not asking you to tell me what happened. I'm asking you to tell me why you didn't tell me." What Brad told me, over that call and a longer conversation a few days later, was something like this. When the previous tenants moved out 14 months ago, his apartment lease was coming up for renewal around the same time, and his rent had gone up, not enormously, but enough that, combined with some other expenses, he was feeling squeezed. The house sitting empty, with him paying both his own rent and his half of the mortgage on an empty property, started to feel, in his words, like throwing money away on 2 places when I could just live in one of them. He told himself at first that it would be temporary, that he'd move into the house for a few months, get it back in shape, and then find new tenants the way he'd told me he was doing. But the longer he lived there, the more the idea of going back to apartment renting, on top of his half of the mortgage, felt like a step backward. And once Courtney moved in a few months later, the math, from his perspective, got even more complicated. Because now, telling me the truth wouldn't just mean admitting he'd been living there. It would mean admitting that his girlfriend was living in a house I half-owned, which felt, to him, like a much bigger conversation than the one he could have had 4 months earlier. Every month that went by, he said, it felt like the conversation had gotten bigger. Like in month 1, it would have been, "Hey, I moved into the house, is that okay?" But by month 6, it was, "Hey, for the last 6 months I've actually been living in the house and didn't tell you. Also, Courtney's here now too." And I kept telling myself I'd bring it up, and then I'd think about how that conversation would actually go, and I'd just not. I asked him at one point whether Courtney knew the full picture, whether she understood that the house she was living in was something I co-owned, and that I had no idea she was there. Brad got quiet, and then admitted that Courtney had, in fact, asked him about it early on. Apparently within the first month or 2 of her moving in, she'd ask something like, "Wait, doesn't Whitney still technically own half of this place? Does she know we're here?" And Brad had told her that it was complicated, and that he and I had an understanding about the house, which wasn't true, but which Courtney, reasonably, had no way of knowing wasn't true. That detail actually mattered to me in a strange way. It meant Courtney wasn't someone who'd knowingly moved into a situation built on a lie to me. She'd asked the right question, gotten a reassuring-sounding answer from someone she trusted, and moved on with her life, the same as I had been doing for 14 months on my end. I never had a conversation with Courtney about any of this, and I don't think I needed to. This was never really about her. I had to figure out what, if anything, to tell the kids and how. Tyler already knew, in the sense that he'd been the one to mention it, but he didn't know that what he'd said had turned into anything significant, and I didn't want him carrying any sense of guilt about that. I sat him down a few days after my first conversation with Brad and told him, simply, that what he'd mentioned about the house had actually been new information for me. That Dad and I were going to work out some details about the house because of it, but that none of it was anything for him to worry about, and that he hadn't done anything wrong by mentioning it. He looked relieved, mostly, and then asked if this meant they'd have to move again, and I told him honestly that it might, but that if it did, I'd make sure it didn't disrupt his last year of school. Ava, who's away at college, I told over the phone, in a little more detail, since she's an adult, and since she'd lived in that house the longest of any of us before leaving for school. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I wasn't expecting. "Honestly, I'm kind of not that surprised. Whenever Dad talked about the house this past year, he always sounded weirdly specific about it, like he knew details a landlord managing from a distance wouldn't really know. I never thought about it hard enough to put it together, but looking back, yeah. It was a strange thing to hear, that some part of this had been faintly visible the whole time, to someone who wasn't even living in the same state, simply because she'd been listening a little more closely than I had. Here's something worth pausing on. Only about 3% of people who watch videos like this one ever actually subscribe. If this story has you wondering what happened next, that small click helps this channel keep finding stories like Whitney's. Okay, back to it. I asked Brad directly whether he understood that this meant I'd been paying my half of the mortgage on a property that, for 14 months, had effectively been his free housing. That the $9,800 I'd put into that joint account wasn't going toward our shared asset sitting empty. It was going toward half the cost of a house he and Courtney were living in rent-free, while I separately paid rent on my own place in full. He said yes, he understood that, and that he knew it wasn't fair, and that he'd pay me back. He just hadn't figured out how, financially, because, in his words, the reason I moved in there in the first place was that I couldn't really afford my apartment and the mortgage both, so I don't actually have $9,800 sitting around to just hand you. That response, "I don't actually have the money," was, in a strange way, the moment I stopped being primarily angry and started being primarily focused on what I actually wanted to happen next. Because it made something clear to me. This wasn't a situation where Brad had simply made a bad judgment call about communication, and the underlying arrangement was otherwise fine. The underlying arrangement, me continuing to be financially entangled with Brad through this house, for another roughly 8 months until Tyler graduated, depended on a level of trust and transparency that had just been shown not to be reliable regardless of Brad's intentions. I called Mr. Alvarez, the family law attorney who'd handled our divorce, not to start some adversarial process, but because I needed to understand my actual options under our settlement agreement, and I wanted that information from someone other than Brad. Mr. Alvarez pulled up our settlement and walked me through it. The agreement specified that the house would be sold no later than 2 years after our younger child's high school graduation, with the rental income sharing arrangement in place during the interim period. It also had a clause, one I genuinely didn't remember being a significant point of discussion at the time, but apparently is fairly standard, allowing either party to petition for an earlier sale in the event of a material change in circumstances affecting the property's use or income. What you've described, Mr. Alvarez said, is about as clean an example of a material change in circumstances as I've seen. One party has been occupying the jointly owned property as a personal residence, undisclosed for over a year, while the other party continued to pay carrying costs based on the property's intended use as a rental. You'd have a very strong basis to petition for an earlier sale. And frankly, I think most judges would view the 14 months of undisclosed occupancy fairly unfavorably for Brad if this ended up needing a hearing. He also walked me through what most judges would view unfavorably might actually mean practically that beyond just forcing an earlier sale, I'd likely have a reasonable claim to some form of reimbursement for the $26,000 gap, either as a direct repayment or as an adjustment to how the eventual sale proceeds were split. I asked him a question that had been sitting with me since the drive-by, whether, technically, what Brad had done even counted as something I could have stopped if I'd known about it at the time. Mr. Alvarez said that was actually a more interesting question than it might seem. Under the settlement, Brad didn't need my permission to occupy the house himself. There was nothing in the agreement that explicitly prohibited either of us from living there. What he needed my agreement on, and didn't get, was the change in the underlying financial arrangement. Continuing to accept my mortgage contributions as though the house were still being treated as a rental when it had stopped being one. If he'd called you on day one and said, "Hey, I want to move back into the house instead of renting it out, and obviously that changes how we should be splitting costs, let's figure out new numbers," that's a conversation. Maybe not a fun one, but a normal one, and probably one you'd have been able to work through. What actually happened wasn't that conversation. It was the absence of that conversation for 14 months, dressed up as a series of small updates about tenants and carpets. That distinction helped me a lot, honestly. It helped me separate, in my own head, Brad made a decision about his living situation that affected our shared arrangement from Brad lied to me repeatedly and specifically for over a year. Both things were true, but they weren't the same size, and I think understanding that helped me figure out what I actually wanted out of this, rather than just reacting to how betrayed I felt. Mr. Alvarez also raised something practical I hadn't thought about. If I went the route of petitioning for an earlier sale through the court, even on strong grounds, it would likely take a few months to schedule a hearing. And during those months, the underlying arrangement, me still nominally splitting costs on a house I now knew the real situation of, would stay in some kind of limbo. My honest experience, he said, is that in situations like this, the threat of the petition is often more useful than the petition itself. Most people, once they understand a judge is genuinely about to get involved and that the facts aren't really in dispute, would rather negotiate a faster, cleaner resolution than have a stranger in a robe decide it for them. I asked him what he'd do if he were me. He gave me an answer similar to the one Mr. Whitfield gave Erica in a completely different situation, which I only know about because I've actually watched some of these stories myself. He said something like, "I can tell you what's legally available to you. I can't tell you what's going to feel right for your family going forward, especially with two kids who are going to have relationships with both of their parents for the rest of their lives, regardless of what happens with this house. My suggestion is usually, figure out the version of this that gets you what you actually need, and is also a version you can live with having done 2 years from now." I sat with that for a few days, and then I called Brad again, and this time I came with a proposal rather than just questions. I told him I wasn't going to pursue reimbursement for the full $26,000, partly because I genuinely believed he didn't have it, and pursuing money someone doesn't have tends to just create a different kind of mess, and partly because, honestly, some part of me didn't want this to become a story that was primarily about money, even though the money was real and mattered. But I told him that I wanted 2 things. First, I wanted the house listed for sale now, not in 8 months, now, using the material change in circumstances clause, with Mr. Alvarez handling the paperwork to make it formal rather than just an informal agreement between us that could shift again later. Second, I wanted Brad to cover the costs of moving. For me, this time, since I'd be the one finding a new place on a timeline I hadn't chosen, as a partial, practical acknowledgement of the $26,000 gap, even if it didn't come close to covering it. Brad agreed to both, without much negotiation, which I think was its own kind of acknowledgement that he knew, underneath everything, that this was a fair landing point given what had actually happened. There was one more exchange from that conversation I want to include because I think it's the moment that actually mattered most, more than any of the financial or legal details. Near the end of the call, Brad said, "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just sorry it came out. Sorry I did it. I think somewhere around month 4 or 5, I knew I should just tell you, and the longer I didn't, the more I think I sort of stopped letting myself think about it directly. Like I'd catch myself almost bringing it up, and then I'd just redirect the thought, almost without deciding to. I'm not saying that to get out of it. I just want you to know it wasn't that I sat down one day and decided to lie to you for over a year. It was more like I never undecided to after the first time." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I believed him, and I did, and still do. I think that's actually part of what made this whole thing so disorienting for me. It would almost have been easier, in a strange way, if Brad had been a different kind of person, someone calculating, someone who'd planned this out. Instead, he was the same person I'd been married to for 16 years and co-parented well with for 4, someone who, faced with an uncomfortable conversation, did the extremely human thing of putting it off. And then putting it off again, until the putting off became its own kind of decision, made by default rather than on purpose. The few months between that conversation and the house actually selling were, in their own way, the strangest part of this whole experience, Not dramatic, just quietly surreal. Brad and Courtney moved out about 6 weeks after our conversation, into a rental across town. I went to see the house for the first time in over a year, the week after they moved out, before it went on the market. Mr. Alvarez had suggested it might be useful for me to walk through it, partly for practical reasons related to the sale, and partly, I think, because he sensed I needed to. Walking through, it was emotional, in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. The house was basically empty by then, echoey in the way houses get right before they're shown to buyers, but I could still see traces of the life that had been lived there without me. A faint discoloration on the living room wall, where presumably one of Courtney's larger plants had sat for over a year. A second set of hooks added near the back door, at a slightly different height than the ones Brad and I had put up years ago. Small, ordinary signs of a household I'd had no part in and no knowledge of, in a house that still had my name on the deed. I stood in what used to be Ava and Tyler's old playroom, by then just an empty room with sun coming through the blinds for a few minutes, and I think that was the moment I actually grieved the house itself, separately from anything to do with Brad or the 14 months. It had been a really good house for a really long time for our family. And its last chapter, the one I hadn't been part of, was now over too, and in a few weeks it would belong to someone else entirely. There was something clean about that, even in the sadness of it. The house went on the market about 6 weeks later. Brad and Courtney had to find their own place, which, from what Tyler's told me, they did fairly quickly, a rental about 10 minutes from where Brad's old apartment had been. The house sold about 2 months after that, for a little over its estimated value, which softened the financial side of things somewhat. My half of the proceeds ended up being enough, combined with what I'd been able to save, to put a meaningful down payment on a smaller townhouse, also in the Bench neighborhood, close enough that Tyler's last year of high school wasn't disrupted. Tyler took the news about the move better than I expected. I think, in the way that teenagers sometimes surprise you, he'd already half processed that the house had become a complicated word in our family's vocabulary, even if he didn't know the details, and a clean ending to that complication was, if anything, a relief to him. The new townhouse is smaller than the old house. Tyler's room is noticeably more compact than the bedroom he grew up in, and there's no backyard, just a small shared patio. I worried, more than I let on, about whether that downsizing would feel like a loss to him on top of everything else. But a few weeks after we moved in, he told me, in the kind of unprompted way teenagers sometimes say the things that matter most, that he actually liked the new place better. It was closer to his friends' houses, and it feels like yours, Mom, not like a house that used to be all of ours and now it's just sort of not. I hadn't realized how much the old house had quietly become, for him too, a place haunted by an arrangement that no longer made sense, and how much lighter an honestly sized, honestly owned space could feel, even when it was smaller. My relationship with Brad now is civil, genuinely civil, not performatively civil. We still co-parent well. He still comes to Tyler's events. We still coordinate without much friction. But there's a distance now that wasn't there before, even in the years right after the divorce when our co-parenting relationship was, in some ways, at its warmest. We don't have the joint account anymore. We settled what was left in it as part of the house sale, and now we just split specific costs as they come up, each from our own accounts, which is a small thing but feels, to me, like an important one. I don't think Brad and I will ever go back to the kind of easy, low-stakes friendliness we had for those first couple of years post-divorce. I've made peace with that. Some things, once they happen, change the shape of a relationship permanently. Even when nobody's trying to be the bad guy, even when an apology is real. When I think back on everything now, here's what sticks with me most. The first thing is about how temporary arrangements quietly become permanent when nobody's checking in on them. Brad told himself, in month 1, that moving into the house was temporary, a stopgap while his finances sorted themselves out. By month 6, it wasn't temporary anymore, but by then, the cost of saying so out loud had grown so much that it never got revisited. I think about how many arrangements in my own life, not just financial ones, started as just for now, and never got a real check-in, simply because revisiting them felt harder than letting them continue. The second thing is about the specific danger of an arrangement that depends entirely on one person's honest reporting, with no independent way to verify it. Our settlement wasn't poorly designed. Exactly, splitting rental income and mortgage costs on a jointly owned property is a completely normal arrangement. But it depended on Brad accurately telling me what was happening with a property I couldn't see day to day. I'm not saying every shared financial arrangement needs to be treated with suspicion, but I think, going forward, in anything financial that depends on someone else's word about something I can't directly observe, I'm going to build in some kind of occasional, low-key check-in, not because I assume people will lie, but because the absence of any check-in is exactly the condition that let this go on for 14 months. The third thing is about how the size of an unspoken thing grows the longer it stays unspoken, and how that growth becomes its own reason not to speak it. Brad's month 1 conversation would have been almost nothing. Hey, I moved into the house, is that okay? His month 14 conversation, the one that actually happened, was enormous, and it happened only because a 16-year-old said something by accident. I think about this a lot now in my own life, the things I haven't said to people, and how the longer I wait, the more telling them now starts to feel like a confession about the waiting, rather than just sharing the original thing. The fourth thing is about kids and how much they see and process without us realizing it, and also how much they don't realize they're revealing, because to them, it's just normal life. Tyler had no idea he was telling me anything significant. To him, Courtney's stuff is everywhere at Dad's house was just a fact about his life, as unremarkable as the weather. I think about how much information passes through kids between households completely without their awareness of its weight, and how that's not something to exploit exactly, but it is something to be aware of, especially if there's something you're hoping a child won't accidentally reveal. If you're counting on a kid not to mention something, that's usually a sign the something needs to be addressed directly, rather than managed around. And the fifth thing, the one I keep coming back to, is about the difference between an ending that repairs a relationship and an ending that simply, honestly, changes it. I went into the conversation with Brad hoping, on some level, that this would get resolved and things would go back to how they'd been. They didn't, and I don't think they were ever going to. What I got instead was something more modest, but I think more honest. A clear, fair, final separation of something we'd been sharing past the point it should have stayed shared, and a relationship that's now calibrated to what it actually is, rather than what it used to be. I used to think every difficult conversation should aim at things going back to normal. I don't think that anymore. Sometimes the best outcome of a hard conversation is just an accurate one. I'll add one more thing, since people sometimes ask about this in the comments on stories like this one. Brad and I did eventually talk about Courtney directly, just once, a few weeks after the sale closed. Not as part of any negotiation, just a brief, almost offhand conversation when he picked up Tyler one weekend. He mentioned that Courtney had felt bad once she understood the full picture, and had actually been the one to suggest he pay for the movers, before he and I had even discussed it ourselves. I don't know Courtney well, and I probably never will in any real way, but I appreciated hearing that, even secondhand. It didn't change anything about what had happened, but it was a small, human detail that made the whole situation feel a little less like a story about villains and victims, and a little more like what it actually was. A handful of ordinary people making ordinary mistakes that quietly added up to something bigger than any one of them intended. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Has an arrangement in your life ever quietly turned into something different than what was originally agreed, without anyone ever officially deciding that? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. Thanks so much for watching and for sitting with Whitney's story today. I'll see you in the next one.